Hey, how are you? You're looking awfully swift.
Well, like Tom Swift. Hey, Paul.
How are you?
Wonderful. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Let me get this over here to him. I'm going to do this ahead of time.
Oh.
Yep. How's your week going?
It's going good. Things to get down again, get switched over, so I'll get this.
Okay, nice.
Probably getting a bunch of emails.
Yeah. I'll be ready for Monday. Just still, I'm on my second week at the new job.
Oh yeah, how's it going?
Good. Actually, found out a girl that sits next to me is in the Richardson room. She saw my shirt. And was like, you're a Rotarian? She does fundraising or something for the museum. We ended up talking for like 30 minutes this morning.
Cool.
Yeah, but
How was y'all's trip? Good?
it was good. I wasn't able to catch up with my Army buddy because he got COVID, so I know we had dinner reservations, so he like sent me the open table. Yeah, Tampa's really cool. So touchy. It's like Miami's like sketchy. Yeah. Okay, perfect.
I'll just send the report out. Yeah, man.
It is good to see everybody here today, and thrilled that you're here. The first meeting that I have to lead. So, thank you so much. Woo! It is good. You know what? We ought to stand. Is Jill and Alan here today? Where is Jill? There's Alan and Jill. We want to give them a great hand. Round of applause for all that you've done with the parade. It went great. It went just absolutely great. And I know that you'll want to thank them personally, individually later on, but they did a great job, and we're still working things out. Another person that did a good job is Tom Rhodes. Tom, let's give him a hand, and Van, for that matter. You guys, great job. Thank you so much. First order of business, Leo, would you come and lead us in our invocation? Where is Leo? There you are.
Thank you. I wear it well. All right, let's bow our heads. Lord, I'd like to pray for all those that are going through troubles and tribulations, specifically those in southeast Texas that just went through Hurricane Beryl or Bertle, whatever his name was. It was terrible. I'd like to pray for all those that are suffering from hunger, conflict, war zones, Ukraine, the Middle East. Also like to pray for those Rotarians here that have special intentions in their heart that aren't spoken out loud. And pray for us and our club members that we have a productive meeting, Nolan's first meeting as president, and that we have a great weekend. Now for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please remain standing for the national anthem.
And bright stars through the backwoods.
our first order of business has to do with our Happy Bucks, and I asked Mark to do that today. There we go. Does anyone have? Okay, right here, Kathy, Karen.
Real quick, again, I'm so grateful for all the leaders in this room. Fabulous parade. So thank you very much. But the real happy buzz is when I was paving the corner as a walking marshal, and there was some stuff on the ground, some boys. I gave him the cutest little young man I've ever seen, and he looked at me and he said, "Like a good neighbor, stay positive."
That is a happy moment, that's for sure. If you're a State Farm agent, that's for sure. Anyone else have something they'd like to share? All right. Okay, here we go.
I mentioned. I can't even hear myself. Is it on? Okay. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that my mom had a fall, been in the hospital. She had to have brain surgery, but I took her home last Friday from rehab, so she's been home a week. She's doing better. Still some challenges with just making her actually rest because she feels good physically and is able to do things. So just real happy that she's actually back at home now and out of rehab and she's doing well.
That's great, Mark. Does anyone else have something they want to share? All right. Now we'd like to move on to the introduction of guests. Who has a guest that they'd like to introduce at this time?
Tyler Holcomb's back. Welcome back, Tyler Holcomb. Great to see you. No, you're not, but awesome to see you. Oh, all right.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, it's been so long since I've been here. I want to introduce guests. This is my really good friend, Nico Antipuesto. He's currently in law school at UNT, and so he wanted to come see the club, see how he can start to give back to the community and introduce himself and be seen.
Good deal.
I'd like to introduce friends or partners of our speaker today, our speaker, Talmage Boston. This is Tyler Thomas and Martha Hoffmeister.
Give them a
Please
hand.
welcome them.
Is there anyone else? All right. With Herb, would you come up? Herb is our new Sergeant of Arms, and he's going to share with us a word about our foundation.
Thank you, Nolan. We have lots of birthdays today, and I'm not going to go through the names because we have so many, but this is a great opportunity for everyone to contribute to the foundation, and we hope that each and every one of you will. So happy birthday to all of you who were born in the month of July.
And also take this opportunity to, if you'd like to give to our R.C.P.C. Foundation, this would be a good time to do that. So hope that you'll take that into consideration. Now our next thing we'd like to do is have our marketplace advertiser, and Mark NEACE, I think you're going to be doing that.
We're starting a new year. We have several people that were advertisers this past year that have already renewed. There are many of you that have not renewed yet, and you may just not know how to do that. You can do it online on the website, but if you'd like to speak with me directly, we can take care of that as well. We're offering a lot of new things this year for marketplace advertisers to bring more value to those who choose to support the club by being on the back of the hub. So our marketplace advertiser today is Sarah OLIAI. I'm not sure if I've seen her yet or not. I'm not sure if she's here, but as you know, she is our president-elect. She's also the president of our foundation board, and she served our club very well in the parade, a lot of other things. So, and she's also a marketplace advertiser. So she's a board-certified estate planning and probate attorney, OLIAI Law Firm is a boutique estate planning firm. She's a solo practitioner who enjoys working with families and business owners to transfer assets to the next generation. People often ask her, who is your ideal client? And her answer is anybody who understands that the United States has a 100% mortality rate. So everyone needs a will, medical power of attorney, financial power of attorney. And Sarah works hard to learn what each of her clients' family goals are. Sometimes that means understanding what they're worried about as well. And she works with her clients of all levels of assets. Her office is in Old East Dallas. She invites you to call and set up an appointment for a free consultation, or if you know someone in your daily life and you hear somebody talking about they need help in those areas, please remember Sarah, and let's thank her for supporting the club and being a marketplace advertiser.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. All right, I have a couple of announcements I want to go through right now. You might have noticed as you came in that there was an organizational chart on your table. Well, we've worked hard, our shadow board and others have been involved in that, to put that together. You know, we have goals that we're trying to reach in 2024-25 year. It kind of reminds me of a story I heard about when a tired family hit the road for the third day of their long vacation trip. Their daughter, her 8-year-old daughter, asked this question: "Daddy, when we get where we're going, will we finally be there?" And you know, that's one of the things that we've got to ask ourselves: where are we going, and how can we get there, and how will we know when we get there, for that matter? So one of the things that has changed this year is the nomenclature that has to do with the organizational chart, and then also the you might see this on your table as well. This is the team's description. This is fresh off the presses. We finished it yesterday, or maybe even yesterday, and it really gives a description of the different areas that you can serve in. One of the things that we did this year is we tried to move away from some nomenclature that didn't really make sense, that pointed to our board of directors. One of those areas was institutional outreach. Well, no one knew what that really was. So what we've done is we've reallocated or changed that nomenclature to point in the direction of our strategic priorities. Now, you all know that our strategic priorities are fostering leadership, tackling hunger, and supporting health and wellness. Those are the three areas that we're trying to focus on. So institutional outreach is now fostering leadership. Community outreach is now tackling hunger. And humanitarian outreach is now supporting health and wellness. And we have 3 just outstanding directors that are responsible for those areas. And one of the things that we hope to do this year is to encourage everyone in our club to line up and maybe focus their attention and volunteer in the area that they're most interested in. If that's fostering leadership, if that's tackling hunger, we've done a great job. By the way, I got this in an email just a couple of days ago from Susan Glenn, and it was saying that we were able to raise $57,393.65 in our gifts at the parade, but with matches, what this resulted in was $193,574.60 with matches. That's what we raised through the parade. Now, isn't that great? That is absolutely tremendous. But you know, that's tackling hunger, and you might want to plug into one of those areas, one of those different teams that is listed under that different category, and plug in and start working and getting some of those goals accomplished. The other things that I wanted to mention to you have to do, let me see if I can get it all here. Okay, has to do with the org chart and the team descriptions should match much better so that we understand where we're going, and hopefully we'll know when we get there. And then finally, just an announcement, just so you know about this, Rotary Means Business will be meeting on Tuesday, 8/13, that'll be, August 13th of 24 at 12 Cuts Brazilian Steakhouse from 5 to 7:30. So that is coming up in about a month, and we are going to be focusing on trying to shift our PCR Connect into this Rotary Means Business happy hours and or gatherings. So that's one of the things we're going to be doing. Now, Sergio, let's get the raffle. See who's the winner today. Okay. We have $1,849 in the kitty as of right now, and Talmage Boston is going to pick the winner, who will be able to come up and pick a card, and if that card happens to be the ace of spades, they win half of the pot. Okay, drum roll, please. The last four are 96-24. Who's the happy winner? All right, good deal. Now, I think I might need to shuffle these cards. You've been here before. I don't need that, but I trust you. Okay, let me see.
I'm feeling lucky.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, I'm feeling lucky. No, I'm not lucky.
Oh, well, she has a souvenir from her chance to draw. Anyway, thank you. So that's continuing to go up, and by the way, these funds are used for good causes. Then, let's see here. The chair of the day today is Richard Stanford. And so, Richard, come on up and tell us about Talmage Boston, what a great guy he is. I've read a lot about you already, and look forward to hear what Richard has to say.
And notice, blue shirt, blue coat, tan pants, brown shoes.
We're Twinkies, okay?
Now, Talmage Boston is a well-known longtime civil litigator in Dallas, and you may know him from the Dallas Morning News. He's a frequent contributing person to the news articles. Active in the state bar, he's been honored many times for his work for the rule of law in Texas. But he's also a great writer. But before I say that, Herb's sitting there. Herb Hammond and Talmage and Horace, all these people that put together Sapientia Book Club. A lot of us do that frequently. Brings national authors to the Park Cities Club, a book and a meal, and it's really fun. Herb told me that if there's anybody in this club that wants to be on the mailing list for Sapientia, do that, because I go to almost every one, so that's fun. But anyway, Talmage has turned into a great writer, prolific writer, on one of his favorite topics, baseball, often on the American presidency, and that's what, now, there are going to be books available back there after this, and you will see on the dust jackets a lot of very famous American presidential historians have endorsed this book. You're kind of making it into that group of people who write about the presidency. So get a book. The thing about the book is the book is really about leadership, too. A lot of us love the history of the presidency, but the leadership thing is really important. This has leadership lessons. Talmage may not know it, but that is one of our 3 strategic priorities is leadership. And the books are about leadership. And so please welcome Talmage Boston.
Good afternoon, Park City's Rotary Club. I hope you're here today because you love history. Now, there are some lowbrows who aren't members of the Rotary Club who ask, what good is history? And my answer is, well, there's really 2 reasons. Number 1, it shows us how much things change. And number 2, it shows us how much things stay the same. And sometimes history can actually be applied to our daily living. And that's my goal this afternoon, showing you 2 ways in which, because things have stayed the same, what I'm going to say can be applied to you and your leadership and your different organizations. First, timeless fact. To be a great leader, you got to be a great persuader. Second, timeless fact. The things that cause somebody to be a great persuader today are the same as they were in George Washington's time. As Richard said in his introduction, I have a new book. It came out on April 2nd. The title is How the Best Did It, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. And as he said, it's a combination leadership / presidential history book, and it covers the most important leadership traits of our 8 greatest presidents: Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, both Roosevelts, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Reagan. Now, in researching the lives of these 8 presidents, I saw they all had a common leadership trait. They were all great persuaders, although they each went about persuasion in his own unique way. So exactly how they went about succeeding as persuaders in leading our nation to new heights in their eras is worthy of our attention this afternoon because, after all, one way or another, we are all in the persuasion business. So with that in mind, let's turn to the presidents, see what made them great persuaders, and see if we can apply that knowledge to raise our games as leaders in our fields. First great president, George Washington. Now, as far as public persuasion oratory went, George Washington was not a great public speaker. He had 2 strikes against him. Number 1, he had a soft, breathy voice, which came from a childhood respiratory illness, which meant that he really could not project. And of course, this was long before there were any microphones. Secondly, as you probably read through the years, he had real problems with his teeth. By the time he became president, he only had 1 remaining tooth in his head. If you've ever been to the museum at Mount Vernon, you see these unbelievably huge and cumbersome dentures that he wore. That's why he never smiled in any of his photographs. And so despite this voice and the teeth issues, he was persuasive. Well, how do you do that? Well, first of all, he was persuasive because everybody already respected him. They knew of his heroic achievements. As a military leader, incredibly courageous during the French and Indian War, had several horses shot out from under him, bullet holes in his hat, in his uniform. It was a total miracle that he supplied the French and Indian War. And then, of course, his great leadership as commander-in-chief during the American Revolution. And then, of course, he was the chairman of our Constitutional Convention. People were aware of all these amazing achievements. And Washington was a great believer that deeds were more important than words. People wanted to hear what he had to say when he finally did speak. Secondly, he earned trust in other ways that made him persuasive. First of all, he looked like a leader, straight out of central casting. He was a sharp dresser. He always had perfect, upright, erect posture. He moved with an athlete's grace. He maintained piercing eye contact when he was in a listening mode, and most of the time he was in a listening mode. He was usually the last guy to speak after he'd heard what everybody had to say. He always rode an impressive white horse, and he was an excellent horseman. In those days, that meant a lot. And at 6'2", he was usually the tallest guy in the room. He's like Van Oliver here. Walked in the room, you can't miss him. And so you put it all together. You put the dress, the posture, the grooming, the horse, you put it all together, the height, and he epitomized what is called command presence. Gilbert Stuart's wife, Charlotte, said that George Washington was the most superb-looking person she ever saw. Abigail Adams basically said the same thing. So he had persuasion by presence, by command presence. So ask yourself, how's my command presence these days? He was also an effective persuader because he had 100% integrity. You remember the Parson Weems biography? Father, I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree. That was a fable, but in essence it was true. Weems was looking for a metaphor that could convey this man who never told a lie, and that's what he chose. And so whatever he said, he had 100% credibility. You could take his words to the bank. Ask yourself, what's my reputation for integrity and credibility in my organization? Washington also had a very rare gift for a politician. He knew when to keep his mouth shut. Now, during his presidency, with each passing month, division among our founding fathers grew worse and worse and worse. Soon they formed two political parties, the Federalists, led by John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, what was then called the Republicans, that has ultimately evolved into today's Democratic Party, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. With each passing month, things got more and more hostile. Washington's primary goal as the first president, besides abiding by the Constitution, was to be the unifier in chief. And so with all this discord going on, Washington knew that if he took sides, it would add to the division. So as historian Mark Updegrove said, conscious that political passions threatened to split the country, Washington largely kept his voice still so as not to add to the passions, keeping his opinions in check until policy decisions were required so as not to add to the divisions. So if you want to persuade like George Washington, ask yourself, do I know when not to speak in order to maintain unity in my organization? Second great president, Thomas Jefferson. Like Washington, Jefferson knew he was not a great public speaker. One of the most interesting things I learned in my research, Jefferson was president for 8 years. In 8 years, he gave a grand total of 2 speeches. His 2 inaugural addresses were the only speeches he gave during his presidency. But we know, yes, you can be persuasive in addressing large crowds, but you can also be persuasive in small groups and one-on-one. And that's where Jefferson was a master persuader. He entered as our 3rd president right after John Adams' presidency, which in many ways had been a disaster. Adams always had a thin skin. Most of his comrades in the Federalist Party did as well. The Federalist Party controlled Congress during Adams' presidency, and they passed something called the Sedition Act, which made it a crime punishable by incarceration for anyone to criticize either Adams or any Federalist policy. So people were actually being thrown in jail by exercising their free speech and freedom of the press rights. Fortunately, the Sedition Act expired at the end of Adams' presidency, but that was the nation that Jefferson was coming into as our 3rd president. And so for the first thing he did, his first inaugural address, he famously said, look, folks, we are all Federalists. We are all Republicans. We're all Americans, so we better start acting that way or this country isn't going to make it. And so then, to break down all this polarization, Jefferson, during the course of his 8-year presidency, 2 to 3 times every single week would organize dinners around tables just like this, 8 people, 10 people, 12 people, lots of good wine, lots of good food, Federalists, Republicans, one rule: we will not talk about hot-button political issues. We'll talk about music, we'll talk about history, we'll talk about literature, we'll talk about what you do for a living, we'll talk about what your family is. In other words, we'll talk about the things that people talk about when they want to be friends. And it worked. It didn't work on the first dinner, the 3rd dinner, the 5th dinner, but week after week, month after month, year after year, the walls started coming down. There's an old political saying that's still on point about the art of politics, and that is politics is all about relationships. If you have great personal relationships, you're going to be able to move the needle politically in your organization. Jefferson understood that. Another old saying that still applies that Jefferson incorporated: if somebody likes you, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt. And if they don't, they won't. So at these dinners, people decided, we may have different political beliefs, but you know what? I like you. There's a lot to like about you. Don't you wish we could do that today? And so over the course of the 8 years, the country became more and more, among its leadership, harmonious. In his Jefferson biography, John Meacham said that at his dinners, the president's, quote, social civility, grace, and hospitality softened the strident partisanship as feelings evolved from hostility to at least partial respect. So if you want to persuade, like Thomas Jefferson, ask yourself, how am I doing at building relationships with people who I don't necessarily agree with? Third great president, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, we all recognize, was our most eloquent president. And you wonder, I wonder, how did he get to be so eloquent? He had less than 1 year of formal schooling. He didn't complete grade school, junior high, high school, college, law school. In his childhood, less than 1 year, and that was it. How did he get to be so eloquent? Well, he had 3 activities that dominated his life, and in particular his adult life. First, starting in childhood, he read constantly. Of course, he's living out on the prairie where not many people were there, and the people that were there didn't have many books, but the books they had were great books. And Lincoln read them over and over and over again. The King James Bible, Shakespeare's plays, Aesop's fables, the great poets. And he had a photographic memory. He not only read these books and reread them, he memorized large chunks of them, and he could incorporate them into his conversation or his speeches. Secondly, he was a successful lawyer. You know that. Trial and appellate. And if you're a successful trial and appellate lawyer, you become an expert at how to frame an argument. You also become an expert at recognizing you got to talk differently to different groups of people. You talk differently to juries than you do to judges, than you do to clients, than you do to opposing counsel. He got that. And third, he was a politician who ran for public office most of his adult life, which meant that he was speaking to crowds constantly. And for him, practice made perfect. So these word power foundations that came from his being a reader, a lawyer, and a politician caused Lincoln to hone his skills throughout his adult life. So if you want to persuade like Lincoln, ask yourself, what am I doing to get ongoing practice in my communications? Well, as we know from history, he was the master of rhetoric. His speeches, the Gettysburg Address, the second inaugural address that ends with malice toward none with charity for all. They're America's greatest speeches. And they were so great because he understood 5 word power traits that he used to create those speeches. First, he was obsessed with word precision. He said exactly what he meant with no ambiguity, and there was never a wasted words. Many of you in your schooling read Strunk and White. That book can be boiled down to 8 words. Say exactly what you mean. Eliminate unnecessary words. That book came out 50 years, the first edition, 50 years after Lincoln's death, and yet he already had it mastered. The Gettysburg Address has 272 words, which means that it's less than half the size of a normal newspaper editorial. It took 2.5 minutes for him to deliver. I spoke in Gettysburg about 6 weeks ago, and they've got a wonderful new museum, which I encourage you to go to. One of the films said, in less than 3 minutes, he changed the soul of a nation. His second inaugural address, 702 words. Took him a little over 5 minutes to deliver. Now, you don't get that tight without any unnecessary words, with absolute clarity, with no ambiguity on a first draft or a third draft or a fifth draft. It takes relentless editing to get it that tight, and Lincoln did that. So ask yourself, how many rounds of editing do I go through before I'm satisfied that my words are airtight? Second, word power rhetoric skill. Like Washington, he never misrepresented or overstated anything. Remember his nickname? Honest Abe. Like Washington, you could take his words to the bank. Third, he knew how to build rapport with audiences by using wit and telling stories. But he didn't overdo it. He didn't try to be a comedian. People like to smile, but let's not get lost. What's the message? People like to learn lessons based on stories. Fourth, when he reached his persuasion climax, He spoke with an impassioned, earnest tone. You saw that Daniel Day-Lewis in the Lincoln movie. But he never got emotional. He thought getting emotional to persuade was manipulative and therefore intellectually dishonest. He wanted no part of that. And then fifth and finally, he made sure his words had rhythm so that they could be more easily processed, so that they would resonate, reverberate, and penetrate. One of my pet peeves is when I go to a wedding or a funeral and they ask some young family member to get up there and read Scripture. And they read as fast as they possibly can in a monotone. And you don't even know what they said. And you say, why'd you even read it if you weren't going to put any power into it? And power comes from rhythm. Remember how the Gettysburg Address ends? This nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And this government, of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Rhythm. I'm sure many of you have read David McCullough's wonderful books, two of which won the Pulitzer Prize. And I had the privilege of doing several programs with David on those books. And he said he had a rule that every time he finished the final version of a chapter, and I mean final version, ready to send it to his publisher, he would go into his living room and have his wife Rosalie read it aloud to him so he could satisfy himself that the words on the page had the desired rhythm. He knew that if they didn't, they wouldn't penetrate. So if you want to persuade like Abraham Lincoln, ask yourself, what am I doing to maximize my word power? Fourth great president, Theodore Roosevelt. Now you remember it was TR who coined the phrase that if you get elected president, you thereby have the power of the bully pulpit. And he spoke to crowds often from his bully pulpit. But in fact, he was not a great public speaker. Like the young kids at the funeral, he talked too fast. You couldn't process it. They didn't have rhythm. His words didn't resonate. And thus, for the most part, they were not memorable. But he showed his power of persuasion most effectively, not by preaching from the bully pulpit, but by being up close and personal and effective as a mediator. Now, some of you have been through a mediation. That's where people are at war with each other. Sometimes countries are at war and they need a mediator to have peace. Sometimes people and companies are at war in lawsuits. They need a mediator to bring peace. The mediator is neutral. The mediator builds rapport with both sides. The mediator is creative at coming up with possible ways that we can come up with common ground that both sides can agree upon and have a settlement and put their war to an end. And Theodore Roosevelt, to be this incredibly effective mediator, used his high energy level, his brilliance. He's probably our highest IQ president. He wrote more books than any president. He read more books than any president. And like Lincoln, he had a photographic memory. He remembered everything he ever read. And he would take command of these diplomatic discussions, and he would talk, and he would listen, and he would learn in order to come up with ways to find common ground. In her biography of Theodore Roosevelt titled The Bully Pulpit, Doris Kearns Goodwin described his power as a mediator this way. He used his unusual powers of concentration, his rich cadre of ideas, and his ruthless single-mindedness, together with warmth, unabashed intensity, and pluck of personality to move people toward settlement. And he was incredibly successful. In 1902, he'd been president 1 year, and there was a national coal strike. And it went on for months and months and months. And winter was coming. And if winter came and the coal strike wasn't resolved, half the country was going to freeze to death because nobody had any coal. No American president had ever gotten involved in a labor dispute before. But Roosevelt took it upon himself, brought in the leaders of the coal miners' union, brought in the coal company owners, worked, mediated, finally got them to agree on binding arbitration that ended the strike. People got coal, nobody froze to death. Word got around the world. This guy's good. This guy can bring people to settlement. Japan and Russia, 2 years later, involved in a war. They can't figure out how to end it. They keep killing each other. They call the President of the United States. You think you could solve this? Yeah, I'll give it a try. And he did. For that, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. A couple years later, another war going on in the Moroccan crisis of 1906, and a couple years later, a Hague Convention conflict. Worldwide, this is the guy who could make peace. He knew how to work with both sides, lean on both sides, find common ground. So if you want to lead and persuade like Theodore Roosevelt, ask yourself, what's my track record at proactively mediating and settling disputes in my corner of the business? Fifth great president, Franklin Roosevelt. Now, FDR was persuasive because he was great in two areas of public speaking. Number one, he was a great orator with snap, crackle, and pop delivery. I'm sure you've seen the YouTube of his first inaugural address. The country's in the middle of the Great Depression. And he says, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Made people stop, think, reflect, know that they had a president who wasn't afraid of the Depression, wasn't afraid of doing what it would take to bring the country back, that energy in his oratory. But besides this commanding, vigorous oratory, his second effective method of persuading the masses was through his gentle conversational delivery in his fireside chats on the radio. He gave his first chat 8 days into office. He'd been sworn in. A couple days later, there's a run on the banks. Everybody's pulling their money out of their accounts and putting it in their mattresses. They don't trust their banks. And Roosevelt, the next day, closes all the banks in the country and calls it a bank holiday. And then a couple of days later, he gives his first fireside chat. And in it, in a matter of fact, calm way, he says, here's what we've done. Here's why we've done it. Here's why it's going to be okay. Here's what we're going to do going forward. People heard it. People were calmed down. Next day, he opens up the banks. The panic is over. So ask yourself, do I know when to speak vigorously and when to speak calmly when I'm trying to persuade? But for both types of persuasion, both public oratory as well as the radio conversational style, he succeeded because he knew what the people wanted to hear, because he always kept his finger on the pulse of America's public opinion. How did he do it? He held frequent press conferences. He wasn't afraid of the toughest questions, and he did it frequently, so he'd know exactly what was on people's minds. He also, to the extent he could, with his polio, he canvassed the country on train and car trips. And his wife, Eleanor, was famous. She was on the road basically the whole time, going all over the country and then coming back to Washington. Here's what the people in Arizona are thinking. Here's what the people in Michigan are thinking. Here's what the people in Rhode Island are thinking. He also stayed on top of the newly emerging industry of public opinion polls. And finally, he frequently met with the leaders of both political parties. So he'd be 100% clear on what everybody was wanting on the political front. So ask yourself, what am I doing to keep my finger on the pulse of the people in all parts of my organization? But once he knew what the people were thinking, which was something different from what he thought they should be thinking, he knew how to move them toward his way by delivering his message in increments, knowing that going too fast in delivering his ultimate plan would mean losing his persuasive power, because he'd be asking them to agree with them before they'd had a chance to process it. If you're going to make a big change at your company and you say, okay, folks, here's the message, boom, big change, hope you like it. That isn't the way you do it. It takes time, it takes a number of messages, and you build. And that's what Roosevelt did, especially in the late 1930s and early 1940s. Most Americans were isolationists. They didn't want to go halfway around the world to fight in a war. They'd done that before 20 years ago in World War I. Led by American hero Charles Lindbergh, we don't want to do that. Franklin Roosevelt knew we could not stay locked in isolationism. He knew that Hitler was for real. Hitler was taking over Europe, and he was going to go farther. He was going to try to take over Asia, Africa, Australia, the high seas. And we can't just stay laid back in isolationism. So to move the needle, knowing what the people thought and knowing what the people needed to think, Roosevelt firmly conveyed his message over time in his fireside chats. For example, in an early chat, he said, look, folks, this is not a fireside chat about war. It's a talk on national security. Notice the difference in the word war. We don't want to go war, but we do kind of want national security. Later in another chat, to help America wake up about Hitler's threat to the nation, he told the country, quote, the war is now approaching the brink of the Western Hemisphere itself. It's coming very close to home. Anyone with an atlas, anyone with a reasonable knowledge of the sudden striking force of modern war knows it's stupid to wait until a probable enemy has gained a foothold from which to attack. Close quote. How could anybody argue with that? So his words, messaged strategically, step by step over time, so people could process his thoughts and ultimately come around and agree with them, moved America's mindset away from isolationism toward internationalism, and we were ready to go to war by the time Pearl Harbor struck. So if you want to persuade like Franklin Roosevelt, ask yourself, when it's time to communicate a major change in course at your company or your enterprise, think about doing it incrementally instead all at once. Sixth great president, Dwight Eisenhower. Ike, like Washington, like Jefferson, like Theodore Roosevelt, was not a great public speaker. And yet, our leading historians in the C-SPAN presidential ranking poll the last 2 times, they've taken it rank Eisenhower our 5th greatest president behind Lincoln, Washington, and both Roosevelts. Why? Because when he set his mind on achieving a goal, he persuaded people to get it done. On his desk in the Oval Office was a saying that epitomized his style of leadership. Gently in manner, strongly in deed. In particular, to persuade people to get things done, he knew when to be patient and when and how to play hardball against anyone who tried to block his plan. An example of his exercising patience to accomplish his objective was in his handling of McCarthyism and the Red Scare, which had been going on during Truman's presidency and which Eisenhower inherited. Truman thought the best strategy for dealing with McCarthy was to go head-to-head and insult him, and it didn't work at all. Eisenhower refused to say McCarthy's name in public at all. Over the course of a year, he devised a hidden hand strategy that gave McCarthy just enough rope to hang himself, which he did in the Army McCarthy hearings, and it was lawyer Joseph Welch who brought McCarthy down, and Eisenhower never even had to get his hands dirty. An example of Ike's knowing when and how to play hardball came right before the election for his second term in late October 1956. America's allies, England, France, and Israel, had joined together, invaded Egypt, and seized the Suez Canal. And they did it even though Eisenhower said, don't do that. That's going to screw up the balance of power in the Middle East. It's going to invite the Soviet Union to come in and enter the fray. Don't do it. And they did it anyway because they thought they could get away with it. Well, as soon as they did, Eisenhower responded quickly and firmly to those who had rejected his advice. First, he got the United Nations to impose strong sanctions against them. Second, he refused their request for an alternate source of oil. And finally, he refused to provide the dollars needed to stabilize the British pound. That caused a ceasefire. Eisenhower said, that's not good enough. You get out of the Suez. You go back to your countries. And Britain hesitated. So Eisenhower instructed his Treasury Secretary, go out and buy every single pound you can buy in the marketplace. And he did. And as soon as he had it, Eisenhower called the British Prime Minister and said, if you don't get every soldier out of the Suez right now, I, Dwight Eisenhower, President of the United States, will drive your pound down to 0. In a nanosecond, the British troops went back to England. That's how you play hardball. So if you want to persuade like Dwight Eisenhower, when someone attempts to block your chosen strategy, know when to be patient and when and how to play hardball. 7th great president, John F. Kennedy, whose eloquent words produced great deeds. It's wonderful to be eloquent, but if it doesn't inspire people to do what you want them to do, then you've wasted everybody's time. Kennedy was amazing at the power of his words, which inspired the nation to do great things. Remember his 1961 inaugural address, where he urged America, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And a couple of weeks later, he implements the Peace Corps, and soon tens of thousands of young Americans join the Peace Corps, go around the world, great public relations for the United States, uplifts their career because of the power of the words. In his 1962 speech at Rice Stadium a year later, with these words, he inspired national support for the American Moonshot program. We choose to go to the moon in this decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. And when the speech was over, Congress all of a sudden decided they needed to start funding the space program more and more. And sure enough, we had a man on the moon within the decade. And then a year later, in 1963, he persuaded Americans that ending Jim Crow and giving civil rights to African Americans was no longer a political issue, it was a moral issue. In April 1963 were the Birmingham riots. Sheriff Bull Connor turned on fire hoses on little black children and released dozens and dozens of vicious attack dogs on black adults. And it was all on national television, and it sickened John F. Kennedy. And so he got on TV shortly thereafter and made a speech that was largely extemporaneous. And he said, we face a moral crisis as a country and as a people. It is time to act in the Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in our daily lives. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all. And a couple of days later, he submits a strong civil rights bill, the first strong civil rights bill anybody ever submitted. He works to get it passed, but he gets assassinated. Fortunately, his successor, Lyndon Johnson, legislative genius, pushes it through, and it becomes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So how did Kennedy do it? Persuading people to want to be part of a national service effort, of wanting to spend tax dollars on the space program and the moonshot, American moonshot, and wanting to have civil rights for all. What was the secret? His biographer, Stephen Knott, says that he was successful because his words appealed to the better angels of our nature. That famous phrase from Lincoln's first inaugural. His words did not appeal to people's dark sides, but only to the better angels of our nature. So if you want to persuade like John F. Kennedy, when you're trying to persuade others, where are you going? Light or dark? 8th and last great president, Ronald Reagan, who we all remember entered the White House after Jimmy Carter's disastrous presidency, where we had double-digit inflation, high unemployment, low economic growth, long lines at gas stations, and we couldn't get the hostages released in Iran. America was in a state of national malaise. We needed somebody to bring us out of it. We needed a new source of light, and that person was Ronald Reagan. And to do that, to inspire the nation with this spirit of optimism that Reagan had, he said things constantly along these lines with contagious conviction. We're here to do whatever it takes. America should be a shining city on a hill. My strategy for the Cold War, we win, they lose. On his Oval Office desk, block of wood that said, "It can," all caps, C-A-N, "it can be done." And it was that kind of optimism that never wavered and on which he followed through that brought an end to the Cold War, restored the American economy, and revived America's self-confidence. Pessimists don't move mountains. It takes an optimist to move a mountain. So if you want to persuade like Ronald Reagan, ask yourself, how am I doing at inspiring optimism in my business? So there you have it, my Rotary friends. May you remember how our greatest presidents used their unique styles of persuasion to achieve success. George Washington, persuasion as an accomplished command presence with unwavering integrity, and who knew when and when not to speak to maintain unity. Jefferson, persuasion as a relentless relationship builder. Lincoln, persuasion by maximizing word power through clarity, sincerity, and precision. Theodore Roosevelt, persuasion as a mediator with the power to find common ground between warring factions. FDR, persuasion by knowing when to speak forcefully and when to speak calmly, and by knowing what the public sentiment was and how to move it. Eisenhower, persuasion by knowing when to be patient and when and how to play hardball. Kennedy, persuasion by inspiring us to be guided by the better angels of our nature and not our dark sides. And Reagan, persuasion driven by constant, sincere optimism. So now that you know the history behind how the best did it, may you use it to enhance your leadership persuasion repertoire. Thank you.
Outstanding words for sure. I know there might be some questions that you have. Anyone have a question? We need a microphone too. Is it right there? Where is? Oh, okay, got it. I'll move it. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Right now, there's a lot of division, especially in Congress. What do you think is lacking in their leadership and communication skills that have attributed it to this problem?
Well, a big part of it, going back to Thomas Jefferson, is they don't know how to build relationships, positive social relationships with people across the aisle. That was why throughout our history, until the last 20 or 30 years, people who were in Congress lived in D.C., their spouses knew each other, their kids played ball together, PTAs, the whole deal. Now people who are in Congress are there at most 4 days a week, and the other 3 days are at home raising money. And so when you're not building relationships, it's hard to be able to have positive dialogue with somebody who's on the other side of the aisle. That's a big part of the problem. Secondly, though, too many people get elected to Congress on the basis that they just want to spout their own brand of politics, and their goal is not necessarily get anything done. It's just to be a mouthpiece for their political perspective. And so they've lost sight of what it takes to get legislation passed and to make government work. And that's why there's such a high level of cynicism toward Congress. It's been going on for a while. So until congressmen start getting reelected on the basis of what they've done instead of what politics they're just spouting verbally, I don't know that that's going to change. And until politicians recognize that if we're going to be able to get legislation passed on a consistent basis, knowing that America's always going to have strong differences of opinion between the two parties, I don't expect us to make progress. But on the other hand, if those things start happening, we can once again resume making progress.
That said, is there a dark statesmanship in the country? In other words, do we not have the qualified, persons that can bring statesmanship to government?
We have some. I think they're in the minority, and I think too many times their voices are not heard because they are not far right or far left strident. The big problem is our primary system. That if you run in a Republican primary and you want to get elected, you better be on the far right side. You won't get elected. These 8 presidents that I've talked about, they had 3 common traits. Number 1, per my speech, they were all great persuaders. But number 2, they had self-awareness. They knew their strengths, they knew their weaknesses, and where they were weak, they'd buddy up with somebody who was strong so that they wouldn't be burdened by their weaknesses. But third and most important, they all govern in connection with their eyes on the great American middle as opposed to the extremes. So, you know, I was a big supporter of Nikki Haley. I was a George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush Republican, a moderate, which to many people these days is a, quote, rhino. And that's the extreme right, and denigrating people who are trying to make government work, who have their eyes on the middle. And so until we get back into a mode of realizing this is how government works, you know, in this election, who's going to decide it? Quote, the independents. The independents are the people in the middle. The independents aren't on the far right. They know what they're going to do. The people on the far left know what they're going to do.
But it's the biggest portion, so why aren't they raising their voices?
It's because of the primaries. It's not the biggest portion in the primaries. In the primaries, the people who win the primaries are on the extreme positions. But once you get where one party is against each other's candidates, all of a sudden, it is the big portion, but the people who've gotten their respective primary elections don't think that way. They think extreme.
Anybody else have a question?
Right here. Oh, right here, sure.
Notice the exclusion of one president in particular that I think comes up a lot of times on the list of greatest, and that's Woodrow Wilson. Curious on why he was
No, Woodrow
excluded.
Wilson is Woodrow Wilson's stature has done that in the last 20 years. Once all the information came out about what a horrible racist he was, the president who many people say should have been included is Harry Truman. Every time a president leaves the White House and a new president comes in, C-SPAN, the network, does this presidential ranking poll that I referred to, where they get the country's 150 leading presidential historians to rate presidents from best to worst on the basis of 10 presidential leadership traits. The last 2 times they did it, 2017 when Obama went out and Trump came in, 2021 when Trump went out and Biden came in, the top 9 were identical. 1 Lincoln, 2 Washington, 3 FDR, 4 Theodore Roosevelt, 5 Eisenhower, 6 Truman, 7 Jefferson, 8 Kennedy, 9 Reagan. I think Truman's overrated. Truman had no idea how to bring an end to McCarthyism. Truman had no idea how to get us out of Korea, a war that he started. Truman gets lots of credit for dropping the A-bombs and bringing a prompt end to World War II, which was a no-brainer. There's no way we weren't going to drop the A-bombs. Plan B was for us to invade Japan, which would have lost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives. So I think Truman's overrated, and I think Reagan's underrated. I move Reagan up a notch. But also, I'm trying to sell my book to Democrats and Republicans. And so in the modern era, I wanted to have 2 great Democratic presidents, FDR and JFK, 2 great Republican presidents in Eisenhower and Reagan. I also think in 2024 more people are interested in reading about Reagan than they are Truman. But last and not least, in this era of polarization, I want people who read my book who are Democrats to read and recognize we've had great Republican presidents. And I want people who are Republicans to read my book and conclude we've had great Democratic presidents. Let's break down these walls based on party preferences. Let's look at greatness. And let's think about how we can bring it into our repertoire. The way the book's set up, for each of these 8 presidents, there's typically an average of 3 leadership traits per president that cause them to be successful. And I go into them, tell the story, how they use them. Then at the end of each chapter, I have a list of questions for the reader to ask him or herself, how am I doing in these 3 traits that I just read about? So I don't just want it to be a reading experience. I want it to be people thinking about how can I use this history to be a better leader. So the term I use is applied history. It's one thing to read history, enjoy history. How about let's apply it to make ourselves better in whatever it is we try to do.
That's a good word, Talmage. Thank you so much for your help. And by the way, a book a book will be placed in the Jack Lowe Senior Elementary School in your honor. And appreciate you being here today. Thank you so much. Next week, we have our speaker will be Rick Hart, who is the SMU Athletic Director. And he's going to be speaking on SMU's transition to the ACC. And the chair of the day will be Richard Sanford again. Thank you, Richard, for bringing these good folks. Now, Herb Hammond is going to come and lead us in the four-way test. Let's all stand.
Please join me in reciting the four-way test. Of the things that we think, say, or do, first, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, is it be beneficial to all concerned?
Appreciate you.